everybody. You're listening to podcast episode number 2. I'm Megan, and alongside Jen O'Hara, we are your hosts for the Small Business Bootcamp podcast. Jen and I also make up part of the executive team at Kids First Sports Center, located in Cincinnati, Ohio. Kids First has been in business for almost 50 years and is a leader in the children's instructional services industry. Twice a year, we host our Small Business Bootcamp with our partner, mentor, and Kids First founder, Jeff Metzger. Bootcamp is a 3.5-day total immersion business seminar. Our Small Business Bootcamp podcast focuses on business and entrepreneurship, the unique challenges and opportunities of the children's instructional industry, staffing, training, and so much more. Let's jump in to today's episode.
On today's episode, we have a very special guest with us, none other than Jeff Metzger, our Kids First and Small Business Bootcamp founder, our mentor, and our business partner. We'll be talking with Jeff about his humble beginnings, how Bootcamp was created, and why it continues today, as well as how to build an exit strategy from your business and any other side conversations we can get into along the way. So let's jump right in. One of the things we want to talk about, many of our gymnastics industry friends have heard your story, but it's a good one, and I want to start where you started. Can you walk us through how you found the sport of gymnastics and how that love of sport and coaching led you to running a business like Kids First?
I sure can. First of all, let me say thank you to both of you for this initiative and starting this podcast. I'm sure it'll be greatly beneficial to a lot of people. You all don't realize, here I am in the visitor's chair in my office of, let's see, is that 47 years in essence. So this is almost comical to me to be in this situation here. But I really appreciate what you guys are doing here on the podcast, and even more appreciate the job you've done at Kids First through this very tough year. So the question was about that very humble beginnings. Yeah, I'm a local guy, Cincinnati born and bred, and kind of a shy kid, a little backwards, in essence, an only child. I was quite a few years older than my only sister, and I came from a family that was very, very typical 50s family. Didn't do any traveling, never went anywhere. A restaurant was once a year, so you kind of get the picture there. So I was a pretty shy kid. The social situations, I felt awkward, and then in the 5th grade, there was the opportunity to try out for the stunt team at my elementary school. Well, that was it. I didn't know what gymnastics was. To me, it was the stunt team. It was rudimentary gymnastics by today's standards, but gymnastics nonetheless. Anyhow, so I immediately fell in love with it and found an aptitude, but also an outlet. I found myself I threw myself into any kind of physical endeavor, whatever it was. If it was sports related, in particular gymnastics, but if it was sports related, I threw myself into it, which was something I did not do in the academic world. The academic world existed because it had to, in my mind. It wasn't where I felt comfortable. I felt far more comfortable in the physical world. So at any rate, I was a gymnast in elementary school. I was 5th and 6th grade. Here, I was lucky enough, just plain good luck, fortunate enough to go to a junior high that also had a gymnastics team. Not every junior high in the Cincinnati Public School District did. And fortunate enough to go to a high school that had a gymnastics team, and so I was a gymnast. I was an athlete in all sports, baseball, football. I pole vaulted, but gymnastics was the one, and it wasn't a year-round sport at that time for me or for anybody here in this city. Certainly in the men's world, and so I was. But that was the one that I enjoyed the most. Went to went to the University of Cincinnati, and the era when it had a men's gymnastics team, and so continued my avid participation. I was very good by city and state standards, but not so much by national standards. Really didn't have much national exposure, for that matter. So I continued, as a gymnast, and then the summer of my junior year, I was playing some scrub baseball, busted my leg. It was a bad break. It was career ending because I was going to be near a year in a cast. So that was it for my gymnastics career. And so the coach came to me and said, hey, somebody's been calling. They're wanting a tumbling teacher at a dance school on Saturday mornings. I said, sure, I'll do that. I was bored as could be. I'm in a long leg cast. So I took the job teaching mostly young ladies, how to do rudimentary tumbling skills, because it was rudimentary in general back then, but certainly at a dance school that had zero foundation. But I think an interesting piece of the puzzle is I really didn't like it, and I didn't like it because I'd never been around kids. I was in mechanical engineering. I'm a kind of a technical, analytical, logical sort of fella. I didn't have younger brothers and sisters, as I mentioned. Didn't know nieces and nephews. Never babysat. So here I am teaching kids how to do a sport that I really had never been taught in a progressive fashion. I was in that era in Cincinnati. In that era, it was basically a throw and go approach to learning. And so here I am in a teaching situation where I didn't have a curriculum, and I didn't understand my students. So you can imagine how comfortable that was. But I stuck with it, probably out of boredom in my general life, because it was a tough time when I was in that long leg cast. I haven't been an athlete all my life, but I stuck with it. And months later, it hit me very suddenly as I was on my way to that job. I get a little emotional even, and I realized, gee, I really like this. And so it became obviously been niggling around the back of my brain, but I became very conscious that, I like doing this. So I kind of doubled down my efforts there, took another part-time job at a local YMCA, teach them some classes on one evening, and then our local YMCA said they want to start a gymnastics school. I said, sure, I'll be the gymnastics coach. Mm-hmm. So I was teaching gymnastics. I was coaching my YMCA team for a couple weeks, or 2 or 3 times a week, and other part-time gymnastics jobs. So I made the very logical choice to drop out of mechanical engineering in my 5th year, and it was a 5-year program with the co-op program. So I dropped out of school to teach part-time gymnastics at the local YMCA's and dance schools and wherever I could get a gig, and found out I continued to enjoy it. So I started to any money I saved, I bought a beam and some tumbling mats, and as soon as I had assembled enough, which really wasn't a lot, I found a church that was willing to rent me their multi-purpose room, and for an evening or 2 a week. And so I started my own show. That was 1973, so I started my own show, if you will, and enjoyed that quite a bit. And began to wean out of the other part-time jobs and tried to figure out how to turn that 1 or 2 time a week gig of mine into something more. And I subscribed to the gymnastic magazine at that time. Early on, it was called Modern Gymnast, and so I knew of all the gymnastic schools that existed, and I don't mean to imply that there were a lot in the nation, but there were a handful in the nation. There were none in Cincinnati, and I think none in Ohio, maybe one up north in the northerly part of the state. But so I knew all about gymnastic schools, and so armed with that information and nothing else, zero, I rented an empty warehouse and started a gymnastics school, and that was 1975, and it was called at that time at the church. I called that Kemper Road Center, and then as I rented that empty warehouse, 4,500 square feet, that was called Queen City Gymnastics Center. So the nation often knows our competitive athletes by Queen City Gymnastics, as opposed to Kids First. So that name is still very much alive. And really is part of our entire moniker, which is basically one operation. It's Queen City Gymnastics Center doing business as Kids First. So it causes a little confusion sometimes because we made that rebranding many years later in 1998. So I started with the rented facility, 4,500 square feet. I had no really that implies I had some. I had zero business experience. 0 business courses behind me, other than that accounting 101 course that I dropped. And we drop courses for reasons we can guess about. There's no business experience, but that rented warehouse, Queen City Gymnastics, didn't exist to run a business. It existed to kind of give me an outlet for my coaching passion. Mm-hmm. And so that was the way I looked at it. That was why I started it. That's the way I looked at it. And that's the way I ran it. And it was a means to an end. But I also, so between that thought, and then just kind of a work ethic and a conscientiousness, despite my academic, I want to say distaste, and it does go sometimes as deeply as distaste, but my malalignment with the academic world, I had a conscientiousness and a work ethic. So we did enough right things there in that building to then 2 years later in '77. To build what I believe to be the first custom-built gymnastics school in the nation. You all are familiar with the photos of that and others. We had 2 pits. That was an amazing thing in 1977. I heard that the Soviet Union had holes in the ground filled with foam rubber. Said, I'm going to make me one of them. Mm-hmm. So we made 2 of those, and things went well for the next 2 or 3 years, and we continued to grow again because in spite of not really addressing it like a business and still looking at it as a hobby business and an outlet for my coaching passion. And that's where things got a little dicey because we did enough of the right things, we grew enough so that my approach to business that worked when we were small, when we were only this big, ceased to begin to work as we got to be this big. And the same organizational strategy that we had initially that worked well ceased to work. And I went through a period in about 79 or 80 where I hit bottom. And by that I mean is that basically the stresses of running the business were too great. Were I won't say too great. They were almost too great. So I hit this really as classic burnout. I didn't know how to handle the size of business I had built, and the stresses were too much. And I figured, and I remember saying to myself in so many words that I either got to figure out how to run a business or I'm going to get out of this gig and get a job because of the stresses. Mm-hmm. And when you have those stresses, the coaching, the joy of coaching became less, and of course I still hadn't made that mental transition to running a business. And so I decided that I've got to figure out how to run a business. So I started studying, and for the first time in my life, and started studying the business greats of that time. And there wasn't any help to speak of in the small business realm. It's mostly the corporate worlds, Peter Drucker, Tom Peters, and the like. But I studied what was available in business, and I had real eye-opening experiences through books, and at that time, no podcasts, but cassette tapes, and a few live seminars or workshops of these business folks, and I had my whole. I'm not a fan of buzzwords, but my whole paradigm of what business was about just turned completely on its ear. So in that period, that was 1979, 1980, that was, let's say, 7-8 years after I started the business, I became a student of business and began to realize where my organizational thinking had gone wrong and where that was causing my stresses. So, I made changes. I began to throw my efforts and my passion, if you will, from coaching, being to shift that from coaching to running the business. I relinquished my head coaching job, delegated that to a gentleman named Gary Warren. Many of our industry know Gary through the USA Gymnastics in the recent couple decades. And so Gary became head coach. I became his assistant coach, and that was kind of a real first lesson for me in delegating. It was not too difficult for me. I don't remember going through any particularly tough times in, as you will, letting go and truly delegating the full responsibility of running the show. And I don't know, Gary may have a story that says different to that. I'm not sure, but I don't remember any great struggles like I know people can go through. So that worked well, and I began to see myself as a businessman, not a coach. And so we continued to grow, but I was able to manage that growth through a change in our organizational strategy and change in my leadership understanding of leadership and what that meant. I ceased to look at myself as a boss and looked at myself as a leader. And so we continued to grow, and we built a palace, a 15,000 square foot palace in 1984, and it was a palace by those standards. Sure. We had 9 holes in the ground, and we measured a lot of our success by how many pits and trampoline pits we had. Mm-hmm. So we had 9 holes in the ground. It was quite the palace, custom built. We grew, and 4 years later, 88, we put on an addition of about 6,000 square feet. That allowed us then to move from being a single-dimensional gymnastics-only operation to more of a multidimensional operation, because that additional square footage allowed us to then move into the dance and the martial arts realm. So, and that was very, very conscious. I began to realize some years previous in my that 5-year period of just cramming and learning about business that sometimes maybe going out and finding new customers is not as lucrative or is not the best strategy, and maybe finding a second or a third or fourth product to sell to those customers with whom you've already earned your trust, that maybe is a better strategy. That began to play in my mind, and so it was when we built that 6,000 square foot addition that we really started moving into becoming what we are now known for, which is a true multi-venue product, an MVP. So that was 88, and we remained, if you will, stagnant in that building. And by the way, let me take that word back. It was stagnant in the sense that we didn't build any buildings that we could now take pictures of. But it was not stagnant in terms of what we did within. We made huge changes from that 88 to 98 period. And so it was about 94, I began to say, maybe we can really do something big and better. So began to formulate ideas about, how can we become something really special and really go into multi-venue programming. And we tried so many different thoughts, ideas, strategies. Strategies too lofty of a word for that era, perhaps, but ideas on how we could expand. And we looked at dozens of pieces of land, half a dozen different contractors. By the way, I'm not exaggerating any of that, and began to devise a plan. Kind of 2 plans. We had 2 plans, as it was. We've got to expand. It's time to expand. It's time to do something new. And so one plan was to, so our current facility had then grown now to about 22,000 square feet. So one plan was to add to that 22,000 square feet and put on an indoor swimming program. And this now we're approaching, we're in the 1996 era. And we had the land and we had the means to do that without any too great a difficulty. We'd become a very well-established business. And then the other plan, the parallel plan, was let's scrap it all. Let's find another piece of land and build what we began to refer to as we began to make our decisions as the big show. So we had the little show, and that was the expansion. And then we had the big show, and that was a new piece of land with a bigger building and of some size. So we started building, if you will, on paper, this new piece of land, and that building started at 43,000 square feet. And I began to attempt to get financing for that. The financing, the path of that financing could be an episode unto itself. I've actually one time decades ago created a document in how many banks I talked to, how many pieces of land that we looked at, how many contractors, how many partners, because my net worth really did not substantiate the expansion that I had in my mind. And to make a long story short, I failed 18 times. I had 18 business plans with 18 different banks and failed to get financing for that 43,000 square foot building. And I began to realize kind of where I was going wrong in my presentation, in the business plan itself, and in the presentation of the business plan. And I redid the entire thinking behind it, and started doing this, if you will, product by product. And so I began to devise a multi-venue program, and I looked at could a X number of square feet for a gymnastics school, could that stand alone as a standalone gymnastics school? Well, we'd already proven that. That was an easy one. But then I wanted to, as I mentioned, an indoor swim school. Okay, that was a fairly unique, not totally unique, but certainly much more unique than it is today. Idea, a warm water pool. So I devised my numbers, if you will, and the financial justification for building a 7,000 square foot indoor swim school. And the question was, can that stand alone? And then I did the same line of thinking for dance school, which we already had experience in, martial arts school. Could that X square footage stand alone? And then we wanted to add basketball and soccer and a few other programs. And so the question was always the same. Can we cost justify the construction of X number of square feet for a standalone basketball academy or a standalone soccer academy, or you get the idea. And so when I became convinced that myself internally that yes, I could cost justify that for each one of those particular products, then I added all the square footage up, and it came to pretty much, and then some commons area. And irony or coincidence, that total came to 86,000 square feet, exactly double where we started. So I failed 18 times at 43,000 square feet, failed at getting the financing. Now a year and a half has passed. Our business had improved. Our numbers had improved. I'd made more associates in the business world. So the bottom line is after I redid the plan, and 86,000 square feet. The very first bank that I went to on the attempts at 43,000 square feet jumped on board, so we got our financings. So that was 1998 by the time. So then we went through construction. So now I'm talking about Kids First Sports Center, what we're known for now. So we completed that project, the construction, and that would be an episode unto itself. We completed that construction April of 1998. When we started our overhead, remember this number, our debt service on the building. Now, and when I explain that, we had separate entity that owned the building, but it was not arm's length. It was me who owned the building and then leased it to the company, and that's the way it was for the previous 22,000 square foot facility, and the way it was going to be for this new facility here. Our debt service in that that 22,000 square foot facility was somewhere in the $6,000 a month range. And our new debt service was $43,000 a month.
Wow.
So our overhead, and then we had the commensurate overhead that goes with larger facilities. So what is that? That's a multiple of 7 approximately. So our overhead changed by a multiple of 7 in a period of 2 weeks. When I say that was how long it took us to shut down that operation, get everything that we needed to get moved over here, install the new. So we had a 2-week shutdown of business. So in 2 weeks shutdown of business, our overhead, and I would say with the ancillary overhead expenses, it was probably more like a multiple of 8, and that was on our overhead. So as you can imagine, we did not start out on day one profitable, which was part of the plan. The business plan said it would take us 18 months to become profitable. And that's actually pretty close to how long it was before we broke even. Now we were running a bare bones ship, no frills, etc. But so we remained in the red, and we weren't that well capitalized. There's no way today in today's banking world that with the net worth that I had that I'd be able to sell this to a banker today. I know the banking world too well now. So I did almost the impossible then, which was to put this project together without any partners, and it was pretty impossible then. It's probably more impossible now with the commensurate net worth, etc. But somehow or another, I was able to get that done. So after 18 months, we hit break even, and things continued to move forward despite recessions. I'd proven to myself early on in the business I was worried about what happens if we hit a recession. Now, at that time, I really didn't understand much about economics, even what a recession was or how it might be caused, but I was still concerned about a rough patch. Okay, but we had proven over the years that we were fairly recession resistant. Not proof, but resistant. And so recessions aside, our revenue, we had a record until that changed in 2020 for reasons that I probably don't have to explain. But we had a record that was going for 40, that would make it 42 years. That every year our revenue had grown. So that was a selling point that I would often introduce myself to a bank. So you're looking at businesses that had growing revenue for 42 straight years. And now our profit did not go up. Also, some years we'd be more profitable, and we'd go through maybe an internal expansion, and our profit was more of the typical seesaw with higher highs and higher lows, but seesawish. But our revenue improved every year for that period of time. So COVID did change that. I might add that's another story, and I'm sure another episode. So there, it kind of brings us, to the modern day, and then, then as and you mentioned that we want to kind of move into at some point talking about transition plans, a succession plan of which there are many, but that brings us up to the COVID year, which I won't say anything about because there might be some questions more specific to that. So our business is. I had an interview yesterday with a local magazine, and. I was able to say our business has never had a financial calamity. We've never had a scary patch until 20, and COVID changed all that. As you know, when your revenue drops to zero and the tunnel is of a length that you cannot see any light, and you don't know how long that is. So that's a rough patch for sure. And potentially a calamity as it's turning out. I think we'll be able to look back and say, well, it wasn't the calamity we thought it might be, but it was close. But so anyway, so that brings us to the present day. That's a little long-winded, but hopefully of benefit to those that are on their growth path.
Right.
Well, essentially, you took about nearly 50 years of history and condensed it into about 30 minutes. So that's well done.
Thank you. Not necessarily my strong suit is condensing. Once I found out, I'm not an exaggerator, but I am an elaborator. So Penny will laugh. She said. So just if you ever ask Jeff a question, but if he has any knowledge about it, relax for a minute because you're likely to get the long answer. So.
Sure.
Well, I know we do want to talk a little bit about that transition from you took something you were passionate about. You didn't realize you were passionate about teaching classes way back when in the 70s, and it turned it into this job that became your business. And then you went from being a business owner to being a leader in the industry. And your leadership style and your outreach has been felt across the globe in this industry. And so we want to talk about, I'm going to get a little tearful too. We want to talk a little bit or a lot about, this is the Small Business Bootcamp podcast, and Megan and I really want to talk about what was the impetus behind that? We've just taken a walk down memory lane. At what point in that history did you decide to reach beyond the walls of Queen City Gymnastics?
Kind of a very clear moment. I say a moment. It wasn't a precise moment in time, but I do certainly remember the thought process. But to those folks listening at home, we don't usually sit around the office and cry like this. Let's see here. It was again. It's a 1980ish. That's when 79, 80, and I really can't date it. It was one of those 2 years I've tried. And that's when I hit bottom. That's when I said, you know what, I got to become a student of business, and I did. and I changed my view of the way business works. I changed my view of what leadership was, and things really absolutely turned, if you will, looking back in the big picture, turned dramatically on a dime. I'm sure it wasn't on a dime then, but we began to this is really we began to be recognized as one of the better businesses in the state. And it was about, okay, and now it's coming clear as you're asking me a question as I'm speaking. It's coming back to me, the real impetus. I was about to talk about the 1991 beginning of boot camp, but it really goes much further than that. The real impetus was when we built that building in 1977. I'd heard that they were playing around with these things called spring floors, and I knew that one of the major companies had a spring floor, and it cost $5,000 ish. And there is a story behind that ish, which I won't elaborate on at this moment. We'll do that on the outtakes. And so it cost about $5,000. Well, that was beyond our pocketbooks range. I began to experiment around. We had a company in the city that called Jones Spring Company, and they were local. I went down to Jones Spring Company. I said, here's what I've heard's happening here and there. And so I said, can you make me or prototype for me a spring, or maybe even an off-the-shelf spring? Get me a few of various sizes and various compression ratios and coils and all of the technicalities that I began to learn about. And so, sure, they worked with me. So I began to prototype making spring floors, making a spring floor for our operation. And I devised a spring that was significantly larger than the current spring that was out there, which is about 2 inches high. It's very hard, unforgiving floor. I'd had a chance to tumble on one, and it was better than hardwood or a hard surface, but yet I immediately thought, this is harsh. And so I began to, the engineer in me, still comes out, and certainly came out then. And so I began to experiment with making spring floors, using springs. And I also experimented with tennis balls, and I'd heard other people were doing that too. I experimented with handball because that I'd shifted once I became a non-gymnast. My lifetime sport then changed to handball, which now is pickleball, but that's another story. So I experimented with using handballs, with tennis balls. I thought, a bladder, and I do remember well in that little rented garage making a prototype using bicycle inner tubes. Bicycle inner tubes. Interconnect them all. And you can actually change the, how much air is in these inner tubes, and change the performance of the floor with a little compressor. So I experimented with that, and I laugh at this because the prototype took some hours or a couple days or whatever it was to build. It wasn't a big deal, and the cold water was thrown on it within seconds. The first time I did any kind of just a punch, a experimental jump off of that, I realized that bicycle inner tubes also form a suction cup, and so the return of energy was very slow. And my bottom line was I gave that up within seconds. So it took me hours or a day or so to build it. It took me seconds to realize the folly. I did think maybe if I drilled holes in the wood, but then there's the matting on top. So bottom line was that worked. That did not work. But I experimented with the springs, came up with a method of making a spring floor, told a few of my friends how we did it. It was great. Worked well. We could make it for $1 a square foot, 1,600 square foot floor, 40 by 40 square foot floor. Would cost at plywood prices then of about $8. Yeah, these are numbers I remember. About $8 for a half-inch plywood, sheet of plywood. And add that all together, and that comes to about and the cost of the springs, which I sold, came about $1,600. So with volunteer labor, you too could have your own spring floor. You buy your springs from me, and the earliest price was about $600 for the springs, and then the hardware and the plywood was going to cost another approximately $1,000. So for $1 a square foot, you could have your own floor. Well, in that era, building your own equipment was more the norm than it is today. And when you look at $1,600 versus $500, the bottom line was I began selling spring floors left and right. And I wasn't a salesman on the phone. This is pre-internet days, so everything was done telephone sales, if you will. But I didn't have to be a salesman because the whole product sold itself. I became I was two things. I wasn't a salesman because I didn't have to sell it. It was sold itself. Mm-hmm. So I became order taker, which was the mechanics of taking the order and getting the transaction. And then I became doctor. So, I began to very consciously engage, whoever might be on the phone. After we got done talking about spring floors and how this can, what it can do for you. So I would begin to engage conversations. Tell me about your business. How you doing? How many students you got? What's going on? And that doesn't take very long, that conversation, to begin to get, with most people to get to a conversation about one's trials and tribulations. So I began to, I consciously engaged there. Now, I did not have the idea of boot camp in my mind at that time. So I'm not sure. I can't say I had a why, but I tell you what I did, and that was I just constantly engaged people. And I think really probably because I wanted to educate myself. There weren't, we didn't have congresses where there were business gatherings. There might have been a business topic at a congress, and there may not have been. So there wasn't an opportunity to share, and there certainly wasn't a boot camp. So there wasn't an opportunity to share that information. So I'm picking brains and then giving advice, that I think might help somebody. Hey, let me tell you, I see what you're talking about. Let me tell you what we had pretty much the same experience. Let me tell you what we've tried. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, we've had some good results. So give this a shot. So I began to be consciously, but without a reason, but began to be a kind of a doctor. And so I began to get calls not only about spring floors, but also about business issues. And so with that became a confidence. And also our business, between the business results that we had and then the recognition that we had and then the conversations and the knowledge that I gained in learning about everybody else's business, because there wasn't another avenue to do that, I became confident and, in if you will, helping further. And I remember well the USAIGC seminars, and Ed Nepper, who was way ahead of his time, who created those seminars, series of seminars. And I remember saying to Ed, "Hey Ed, I've learned a lot about business here in the last few years," and I think it's probably about 87ish or so. And I said, I'm ready to talk. I'd like to talk. So I invited myself to be a speaker at the USAIGC series of seminars. Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Chicago, and Las Vegas were the three there for a while, for a few years. Those were the three, not rotating, but three seminars yearly. And so I remember well that first time that I spoke, and that was. I had no experience in that, and I took it very seriously, probably over seriously. Anyhow, so I began to speak then on the circuit, okay, what little circuit there was, and so I began to be further recognized and further gained confidence in speaking and further gained knowledge through that process. So that was a process. And then as time went on, we get now to, the later 80s and the early 90-ish, 80s, late 80s, I'm thinking. And I knew there were a handful of gymnastics schools that had tried to franchise at this time. There weren't the little franchises like the little gyms and the My Gyms at that time. But the full-fledged franchise, the full-scale gymnastics school franchise. And I looked at that, and by this time I thought, I have enough knowledge to do something like that, to leverage my knowledge. That was my thought. How do I leverage this knowledge? And at the time, when I'd walk into a gymnastics event, if there was any business issues, I felt like the smartest guy in the room. I got to say, I don't anymore. Today, our industry is just filled with just great, smart business people. But at that time, people weren't paying attention to it like I was. So I said, how do I leverage this knowledge? And so I looked at franchising, and I came to the conclusion. And, this is, if you will, early days of franchising, and the stereotypical franchise then was McDonald's. And so I came to the conclusion that it's easy, you can flip hamburgers and franchise that, but it's more difficult to flip kids. Franchising, flipping kids is more difficult. And the reason is, very succinctly is it's less about flipping kids and more about building relationships. And that the skill of building relationships, the skill of teaching is difficult to franchise. The skill of building relationships is even more difficult to franchise, because that skill is, we all know how important and how soft and multifaceted that skill is. And so I looked at the franchise approach and said, I don't want any part of that. I'm going to franchise, I'm going to leverage my knowledge, and I'm going to start this thing called a Gym Club Owners Boot Camp. So I devised that plan, and by the way, that was in an era when, to my knowledge, the only boot camp in the nation was the Marines. So now there's a boot camp this or a boot camp that on any street corner. So that was quite, what seems like a very unoriginal name, was quite original, at least in my mind. And so I'm going to start this thing called the Gym Club Owners Boot Camp. And so I had a false start. The first one was going to be early in 1991. I could not get ready in time, and I called. We contacted everybody who had enrolled to say we're going to need to postpone until May. Now, that let me go back on that statement. We contacted everybody but one. One slipped through the cracks, and so it came a day or two or three, I'm not sure, but just before boot camp, and we realized that here we have one party that was coming. Where's Kathy located, Jen? Is it Connecticut. One party coming from Connecticut. They got their flights, and there is no boot camp ready. So I talked to that party and said, "You come on anyway, and we're just going to have a weekend of just sitting and talking and learning about our business and sharing information. So your boot camp, that's what this is going to be." So Kathy and Mike Nowak I'm drawing a blank on the name.
Gym Spectrum,
made it to Cincinnati, Ohio, and we spent time at my home in the gym, and we talked about business. And basically, I did if you will, if there is such a thing, it's a one-on-one boot camp. As it turned out, that Kathy and Mike are delightful people. They're longtime friends now, and I just talked with Kathy, gave her a ring, or an email within the last week. Hey, how you doing? How's things? So we've become long industry friends. So Kathy Nowak was the first boot camper in a non-boot camp in early '91. The first official boot camp was May of '91. It filled very quickly, and we very quickly scheduled a June boot camp. So within a month or so after the first one, we had scheduled a second one. So we had consecutive boot camps. And I absolutely, at the time, I thought boot camp would be a short-lived event, because boot camp is what's known as a fixed curriculum event, unlike Congress, where every year the topics change. Well, at boot camp, it's a story, and so the story is, if you will, fixed. Now, we got to be careful about that, and I will kind of elaborate that on in a minute. But it's a fixed curriculum event, and at the time there weren't that many gym club owners. I wasn't marketing it to managers because who was going to pay that kind of money to send a manager in that era? And a few did, but most didn't. So I thought I'm going to churn through the number of gym club owners very quickly. Boot camp will have a short life, of a year or 2 or 3, and I didn't have I knew it was finite. I didn't have a number in mind, but I figured it was a finite event. How wrong I could have been at the time, how short-sighted I could have been at the time, because boot camp's done nothing but grow in stature and curriculum, I might add, which brings me to that fixed curriculum content is the story is the same, but the details and the subtleties change every boot camp because, well, for many reasons. One being our knowledge changes, and the other being the world changes and the industry changes. So boot camp has been very, very fluid in changing, and here's a fixed curriculum event that changes all the time. Now, if that's tough to reconcile, that's called a paradox. It's a very very effective paradox is the way that we have structured boot camp. It was effective in 1991, and it's more effective in 2021. So.
Thanks for watching today's episode of the Small Business Bootcamp Podcast. We are so lucky to have Jeff with us today for our podcast episode. You might have already guessed that this wasn't the end of our interview with him. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. Our next episode will focus on building a succession plan and how to execute that strategy, as well as what retirement looks like for Jeff Metzger. I use the word retirement loosely. Thanks for tuning in, and subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Google, or Apple Podcasts. Until next time, stay positive and keep moving forward.